Hey folks, and welcome to another episode of Critic Reviews with your host, Arlyeon. On today's episode, I'll be talking about a rather special title, specifically the DreadXP collection. Bringing together 10 different creators, this project tasked them with creating an array of horror titles in a 7-day game jam. Given the broad array of content to be covered in this review, things will be different than the norm, but the ultimate question still remains. Was this macabre collection a chilling treat, or was the most dreadful thing about it the price? Now, as a bit of a preamble, it was a bit difficult going over the DreadXP collection in my normal format, given that each of these titles are essentially self-contained with no overlap between their plots or methodology. In fact, the closest thing to a shared story thread is the narrative preamble that each game has, alongside a particular bit of dialogue you encounter should you clear all the titles within the DreadXP collection. And even then, what you end up listening to isn't necessarily emblematic of what you're going to dive into. Because of this, and the way that some of the titles are narrative-focused, while others are purely gameplay-oriented, I figured it'd be best to boil down my thoughts on the games in general. So that said, on y va. The first title that I dove into was Odd Breeze's game's The Pay is Nice, a narrative-focused walking sim that introduces players to a top-secret research facility. As far as the plot unfurling, it's a slow-burn venture with a focus on its dialogue. Whilst the story arc for this title remains vague throughout, it does begin to introduce increasingly sinister elements, with some of the most impactful coming from the character's introspection. Gameplay-wise, there really isn't that much there, as the crux of what you can do is mill about the office in a relatively linear fashion, with only the briefest moments where it dives into anything reminiscent of gameplay. And even then, it's just an extension of being a walking sim with a focus on ambience. Visually, I found it to be a bit of a mixed bag, as there is a sense of sterility to it that I found a bit bland to deal with. There is some more variety and promising visuals as you progress, but it never quite hit home for me. Thankfully, the game's sound design is a lot more adept at emphasizing that sense of uncanniness and suspense the game's trying to build up. Altogether, I rate it as a fumble, a bite-sized title lacking gameplay, but which managed to still be worthwhile as a narrative experience. Still, I vastly preferred it over Scythe Death Team's Car Thank, a title that places you in the boots of a tomb explorer. Honestly, it's a bit of a weird experience and description given you're spelunking through what distinctly felt like an Egyptian temple, but in space. Doing your best to collect the pieces of a dismembered mummy, since its carcass somehow serves as a MacGuffin key, barring you from the tomb's inner sanctum. That's it. There's not really much to be found in the way of environmental storytelling, and your sole narrative accompaniment is oxygen warnings for your suit. Worse, the game's ending feels more like a foregone conclusion by the time you get there, robbing it of any tension. That said, it's not the bare-bones narrative that had me frustrated at this title. Rather, it was the gameplay, and that's sad, since the game had started off with some enjoyable segments of light puzzle solving and alright platforming. Unfortunately, it eschews puzzle solving in favor of some truly annoying segments, such as in a lengthy escape scene that tasks you with fleeing from a giant rolling pin through a darkened room. What truly infuriated me about this sequence was, while some glowing bits of moss help to indicate where a path is, it's absolutely rife with a number of gotcha kills, like abrupt pitfalls directly after some moss, or bits of debris obscuring your view of where you need to go, which felt immensely cheap. This was even further compounded by the game's enemies once they're introduced, as they'll occasionally just spawn directly in the way of an objective and camp there, just rage-inducing sentries whose sole purpose is to sit still until you venture close so they can issue forth an ear-rending scream and then run at you and beat you into a pulp. And since they're faster than you, you're all but obliged to soak in a few hits in a number of instances. In fact, one of the puzzles involves scaling up a timed precision platforming sequence while being chased one of these, made worse by the fact that it spawns one every time you trigger the puzzle, without despawning any it had created before. Also, there's some weird bits of jank in the game too, like being able to spontaneously die by jumping beside certain walls. It did a lot to leave a bad flavor in my mouth, which is a shame because it's not a bad looking game, and is generally solid bits of music to accompany your journey. It's just the journey itself was a fail in my book, as I genuinely found it neither spooky nor fun. It did, however, make me appreciate David Szymanski's The Pony Factory that much more. I went into this game expecting some sort of rainbow-colored romp against satirical apparitions, and what I got instead was a nightmarish dive into a rundown factory, with my task being to retrieve a hellish artifact that had been used to turn a once flourishing town's population into skeletal equine abominations that roam its dimly lit halls. That introduction aside, the game is still rather story-light as you progress, though there is an epilogue which helps to turn things on their head. Still, it was the gameplay which led me to appreciate this title, as it manages to provide a genuinely solid, intense FPS experience. Part of the reason for this is because of the game's majoritarily monochromatic palette and the factory's deep shadows, as you're unable to see the things lurking in the darkness unless you holster your gun and pull out your flashlight. It makes combat in dark areas genuinely disconcerting, given you'll need to either lure things into brighter lit areas or rely on muzzle flares to pinpoint your enemies as they rush closer. The game's overall difficulty is only further compounded by the fact that you have relatively low ammo and health, making your advance to the factory more of a tentative approach through its derelict guts, as opposed to a more frantic run-and-gun experience. I'm not even exaggerating when I say that of all the titles, this was the one that managed to generate the largest sense of unease and tension from me, startling me in a way that only a decomposing horse carcass lunging out of the darkness can. I thoroughly liked everything that it did, and I appreciate that it managed to resolve itself before it could lose any of its charms, ultimately leading to why I rate it as an extremely solid hit. What's more, it does provide some additional game modes to increase its replayability, such as an even darker mode, or an Iron Man mode, though if you want to know the exact details about what each mode pertains, you'll need to check into the game files themselves and read the game doc, or just futz around and do it blindly. Nothing can go wrong there. Still, if it's a simpler experience you're looking for, there is Erdor's retro-inspired Summer Night, a narrative light experience that seeks to emulate an old-school handheld game, albeit with a bit of a twist, as the seemingly light-hearted game about collecting mushroom begins to gradually become corrupted and dark. A lot of this is seen through the game's presentation, as the retro-styled graphics of the game turn grotesque over time, something that's only driven further home by some rather solid bits of audio that help to make the entire situation distinctly uncanny, especially when those sounds don't seem to come from the game itself. I also appreciate that it wasn't purely a creep-oriented title, as the handheld format, while simple, did offer a fun little game to work your way through, with the gradual corruption of the Summer Night handheld serving as adequate justification for the evolution of the title's mechanics. Honestly, when faced off against what it builds up to, the game's resolution almost feels like a bit of a disappointing, but not enough that it could change my mind about Summer Night being a solid, bite-sized experience that warrants being called a hit. And honestly, talking about this brings to mind another retro-flavored title in the DreadX collection, namely Secret Cow Levels Don't Go Out, a grim, turn-based puzzle title that tasks you with one simple goal: survive the 9 hours it'll take for dawn to break, even as the world plunges into darkness and disarray around you. And that sums up the story, really, as the gameplay represents the central focus here. That said, part of the challenge for this puzzle game was actually figuring out the rules of it, given it doesn't really tell you much of how anything works. Which, may have led to me running face first a monster early on with the hopes that my axe would do something, and also then led to me being devoured by the horrible fleshy hellscape that overtook the map as the turns wore on. It was only after a bit that I realized the game's ultimate goal was to reach the cabin and somehow avoid getting murdered long enough for all 9 turns to expire. And this is where the game gets interestingly tactical and the puzzle strategy elements crop up. See, not only can you move around, you start off with a set of 3 cards and gain a new one every turn. These cards are pretty interesting since they also represent your only means of gaining new playable characters. Whilst these characters cannot move anywhere near as deftly as the protagonist, they do have their advantages, such as providing you the ability to take more actions during a turn, or being a handy distraction for an oncoming monster. There's also cards which allow you to intentionally sacrifice your teammates for advantages. It makes for an interesting balancing act as you progress forward, but it wasn't too bad once I'd gotten a relative hang of things. Though, I'll admit, even after having beaten it, I still don't know what the sacrifice circles do, or some of the items your companions carry do. Like, the board. I really would have loved having some sort of appendix. Nevertheless, in the end, it was a fun experience, and learning enough of its intricacies to progress didn't take too long. Enough that I'd say it's still realistically a hit, though if you're searching for a horror game, you might be disappointed. It's more of an aesthetic element here than anything. Maybe that's how SnowRunner Productions' Rocket found its way into this anthology, but honestly, I really can't be certain. It's also the quintessential example of how the quality of the narrative openings don't necessarily align with the quality of the game, because I loved its spoken introduction, but I have words for this title, and none of them are kind. The premise for the game was simple enough. You're in the process of venturing over towards a party being held within a rundown subway tunnel. Admittedly, the party doesn't have much to offer. You're left with little better to do than venture into the depths of that abandoned passage. I specify premise really because there's nothing really in the form of narrative development that I encountered. Nor any gameplay, really, as the only thing you can do is walk forward and take in the sights of this exceedingly long tunnel. The closest I ever came to any form of appreciation for the game was some of the idle noises that occurred as I walked, but yeah, that's about it. I wasn't super invested in looking at the graffiti along the walls of this tunnel. My experience was legitimately one of abject tedium and dismay that the fucking tunnel wouldn't come to an end for fucking ages. What's worse, when I got to the far end of it, there was nothing there, obliging me to wander my ass all the way back to the other end of the tunnel, which is also where I encountered some sort of weird purple textureless human mannequin that was merged into an identical model slowly walking towards me. Seriously, the only thing I remember about the tunnel other than being pissed and wall scrolls is an anemic grimace with an identical conjoined twin. No payoff or noteworthy destination, and despite the game's hint that the journey might have some intrinsic value, it held no joy for me. I couldn't even drown myself in the pool of water outside of the passage. Ultimately, I hate this entry so vividly that I would sooner recommend a root canal to someone, which is why I rate this as a crit fail. Yes, I normally reserve that for absolutely broken games, but that's just how much I detest this game. But hey, you know what? With that out of the way, it's all uphill from here. In fact, I'm going to take this time to talk about lovely Hellplace's Shatter, a title that places you in the shoes of a nameless traveler roaming the British countryside. Albeit in a dystopian future which is reduced to a rundown shadow of itself, rife with the metal skeleton of civilization. To survive within these ruins, you'll need to make a deal with one of the denizens, something which sets you on a path that promises to change everything. Which, dramatic synopsis aside, what caught my eye the most about its world was the mythology you're introduced to. See, while it's alluded that certain areas of the world enjoy great prosperity, Britain's fractured state has led to rogue AI overtaking the countryside and ruling it over as local gods, the likes of which are worshipped for their benevolence. That marriage of mysticism and technology was fascinating to me concept-wise, but once you become a part of the network and begin to see their influence upon the world, it's both captivating and legitimately spooky. I found myself thoroughly invested in the narrative threads I was pursuing in Shatter, and when the game came to an end, I found myself craving so much more and just hoping that it was more of a well-crafted prologue and that there was more to come. Unfortunately, the gameplay isn't quite as riveting, given that a good portion of your experience boils down to playing it as a walking sim with some light amounts of exploration to be had. Things do briefly change up near the end, but it's less engrossing and more annoying at that juncture, especially since it boils down to a sort of janky chase sequence, and your basic movement speed is lethargic, and your ability to sprint is, at base, pretty abysmal. Still, given its narrative strength, I still would recommend this to fans of sci-fi and Lovecraft. Enough so that, personally to me, it was a hit, and I found myself gushing to people about this. Not a flawless one, but it managed to shine despite those flaws. That said, if you need a bit more of a challenge to entice you, there's always Torpal Duke's Hand of Doom, a cultist-flavored puzzle game with an emphasis on exploration. Premise-wise, it's simple enough. You wake up in a dungeon only to be liberated by a mysterious figure. When you emerge into the world, you're greeted by a plethora of robot figures who inform you that you reside within the domain of the Master. So, obviously, we're going to liberally rummage about the area since there's nothing better to do than try to murder the spirit of this guy for shiggles. There's some slight hyperbole there, but quite frankly, you're not given that much context. Still, the game does do a decent job of building up ambience as you progress forward, both in regards to the areas you explore, as well as the voice acting, which felt delightfully hammy. The big thing, however, that I appreciate is gameplay, is you're essentially tasked with finding and utilizing grimoire spells, the likes of which you'll then be incanting through hand signs. Honestly, the fact that you end up needing to both memorize and do them to solve puzzles was pretty neat to me, though I'd ultimately wish there'd been a bit more diversity in the puzzles. Altogether, I'd say it's a more than adequate proof of concept with some decent moments, but I found myself wishing it delivered more both in regards to its story as well as its gameplay, which is why I'd rate it as a fumble. Entertaining, but not necessarily something I would recommend to most people. Though, speaking of entertaining, have you ever considered what it'd like to be stuck on an abandoned island once you've managed to get comfortably set up? Well, now you can, in Strange Scaffold's Mr. Bucket Told Me To. Though you can also get first-row tickets to the way that comfort is drawing to an end as the protagonist comes to terms with the ramifications of his past. Tonally, the game does a great job of initially establishing itself as fairly upbeat and cheerful, which actually lent itself quite well to some distinctly unnerving moments. While it never scared me, it certainly helped to build a fair degree of tension. There's also a degree of non-linearity in the dialogue options that show up, which is pretty helpful, honestly, given my initial playthrough of the game wound up with me starving to death. Because, like I said, it's a survival game, and whilst it's kind enough to provide you all the tools you need to hunt for food, to gather water, and even to defecate and clean yourself off, things don't stay that easy. As the game progresses, you're forced to make some uncomfortable choices, each of which make the task of keeping your various stats up increasingly difficult. What makes this even worse, however, is that each time you fail to fulfill your needs for a day, you end up losing permanent max energy, making the next day even rougher. The way that your mistakes roll over towards the next day and add a fair degree of tension as you progress, especially as things become harder and you ultimately find yourself needing to very carefully balance out what you can do in order to prolong your life to the best of your capabilities. Both as a concept and its execution, it works. It works well, and I legitimately feel it's one of the stronger titles in the compilation, which is why I rate it as a hit. That said, if you're looking for something a lot more punishing, there's always the final title in the collection, namely Marshlands Outsiders, which sees our erstwhile companion waking up in a mysterious house and tasked with finding a way out before things go terribly wrong. Tone-wise, the game starts off feeling a bit like a supernatural mystery, one which gradually begins to make more sense as you explore the house and pick up on its idiosyncrasies. That said, the element that I found most interesting and uncanny was the way it tracks your deaths as you succumb to the mysterious threats stalking the grounds, painting the walls with bloody messages that hint at what you need to do next, as well as other details. It's neat, and definitely adds an air of threat to the premise, which only becomes further compounded as you continue to die. And, quite frankly, you're gonna die a lot as you rummage about the house, given your ventures are timed, with an invisible murder monster breaking into the house around the halfway point before you're painfully obliterated once the entirety of your time runs out. I mean, on the bright side, at least the invisible monster leaves bloody handprints along the wall so it travels along, and it's nowhere near as fast as the bastard water creature for Amnesia. Not so, fortunately. Not only is it relentless once it's on scene, but a number of key items that you need to acquire in order to access all the segments of the house are randomized, meaning you'll need to get very familiar with it over the course of your runs, and to heed hints that you'll gradually accrue as you get painted across the walls in order to make real progress. It works though. Like, while I started out fairly frustrated with my experience, by the time I progressed through a few loops, I found myself embracing the weird sense of discovery and the building sense of tension that took root within myself more and more as each round ticked down. well, mostly embracing it. I'll admit that level of stress definitely makes formulating sound strategies a tricky endeavor. That's my alibi anyway, I'm sticking to it. But yeah, whilst it took me a bit to warm up into it, once I understood the game's logic, I found myself appreciating it to a fair degree, and the things it did with its story are notably interesting, and there's a decidedly lengthy and neat conclusion to this game, which is why I'd ultimately say it earns a hit. Anyways, that brings me to the resolution of this massive just horror gaming and yeah, holy crap, reviewing game collections is a lot of work. That said, as much as I struggled over these words for a long while, I'd say it was a worthwhile endeavor, if only because this particular collection was more good than bad. By and large, the games either fell within the range of being genuinely solid, or at least interesting enough that I feel they'd appeal to people who are into the niche, with only a specific pair of titles warning active ire on my part. Whilst I do wish that some of the titles were a bit longer, especially the ones that I felt were stronger, I did enjoy the vast majority of what I dived into. Enough so that I'd call it a hit, especially for those folks who are keen on horror. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. If you have an interest in supporting my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know when there's a new release. There's also a Discord, links in the description, so you can become a part of our community, the Crit Hit Cauldron. And, that all said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.